Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today I'll be talking about how Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, raises a question that I think is massive to human happiness. That question is actually also the fundamental problem that this entire video series is wrestling with. Is the human soul or psyche or personality by its nature divided into rational and irrational parts? Or is there somehow an underlying unity behind it, behind these diverse moments of thought and feeling that make up our inner lives? And we've looked, especially in our first few episodes, at how, although this question may seem kind of abstract, it's actually at the heart of our existential hope and our existential despair, I think. And it tends to nag at each one of us, possibly more than we're consciously aware. In this dialogue, this question will take the form of whether eros is rational or irrational. What makes these essentially the same question is that by eros, Plato means not just sexual passion, but human motivation as such. And so we're asking here whether the psyche consists, as I think it must seem to us, at least sometimes, of a thinking ego that's joined to a motive part that's essentially irrational, or at least a part that may have reasons of its own, but ones that are really opaque to the ego. And so a part of the soul really that operates as though it were really indifferent to the reasoning of the ego. Two parts that are, in other words, by nature at odds with one another. And if this is true of human nature, then I think for most of us, it becomes hard to imagine a life that is deeply happy or deeply hopeful. So I think it can, in a way, be a deeply frightening question for us to confront. But it's one that Plato, through Socrates, takes on in his characteristically fearless way. And I believe the answer that he comes up with is ground for deep existential hope. Curiously enough, in both cases, it's Phaedrus, this young friend of Socrates, who spurs the discussion. You'll remember that the pretext in the symposium for discussing eros was the proposal put forth by the physician Eryximachus that each of the guests should take turns praising eros, though Eryximachus also told us that this idea really came from Phaedrus, who was always complaining that mortals don't spend enough of their time praising this divinity. In the Phaedrus, Socrates asks his friend what he's been up to, and Phaedrus responds that he's been talking with the orator Lysias about eros, a topic, Phaedrus says, especially appropriate for Socrates. Lysias, Phaedrus tells Socrates, put forth the idea that, quote, it is better to give your favors to someone who does not love you, and the Greek is me eronti, someone not having erotic passion, than to someone who does. That you might say it's better to have sexual relationships that don't involve intense emotional attachment. Lysias's speech addresses eros in the narrow sense of sexual passion, but I think as readers we're being subtly asked to ask the same question of eros in that wider Platonic sense that we've been talking about. And indeed, it's not hard to extend the same kind of criticism that Lysias makes of eros in the narrow sense to all our passions and enthusiasms. Basically, that eros in this larger sense, this urge to be joined with or experience the good in all its immediacy, is opposed to reason and spurs us to all kinds of insanity. Anyway, Phaedrus is highly impressed with the speech and recites it to Socrates, who is moved to rebut it. So In the symposium, Phaedrus says everyone should praise Eros more. Now he spurs Socrates to praise Eros by reading, basically, an anti-Eros speech. I should say that I'm not sure most modern-day scholars would understand Plato as having a consistent idea of Eros across the dialogues. They probably wouldn't share this idea that I'm putting forth, that by Eros, Plato really means here in the Phaedrus as well as in the Symposium, not merely sexual desire, but desire as such. But I have two reasons for thinking we can take Plato to be talking about human motivation as such here. One is that this is how Plato's followers generally have taken him up until modern times. The so-called Neoplatonists of late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. Another is that I think it's the only way we can really understand the dialogue as a work that is unified by a single theme. The Phaedrus, in my view, is really about the unity of the self. It is asking the questions, why do we get caught up in enthusiasms, especially, but not only, enthusiasms for love and for speeches? And should we allow ourselves to get caught up in them? Or should we resist them? The dialogue is really about how to understand and act on this motive force in us, and the underlying problem of how we are to understand the relationship between these seeming parts of us, the cognitive, the part that thinks, and the erotic, the part that spurs us to action. Plato suggests this question of the unity of the psyche by building up a tension between these two apparent parts of it in the Phaedrus, by throwing us mixed messages, that is, about the compatibility of Eros with reason. What I mean is he shows us in rapid succession green flags and red flags about Eros so that we end up craving a straight answer. So, for example, on the one hand, this passion for words, as we mentioned last time, that Phaedrus and Socrates share, seems to suggest a harmony of discourse and that erotic pull toward the ecstatic. We have another striking suggestion of this harmony of the psyche, I think, when Socrates tells Phaedrus that he has no interest in explaining myth away by reducing it to natural causes. Even though it's mentioned in this dialogue that Socrates rarely goes outside the walls of Athens, he seems curiously and impressively familiar with the mythos of the place in which he and Phaedrus find themselves. It's a spot near where a local girl, Oreithuia, was supposedly swept away by Boreas, the north wind, while playing with her friend Pharmacia. Socrates seems to know the exact spot, and he tells Phaedrus he thinks there's an altar to Boreas there. Phaedrus tells him he'd never noticed it, and then asks him, as though astonished, whether Socrates in fact believes the legend. And Socrates responds that it's typical of intellectual types to try to explain away such myths. I could tell a clever story, he says. I could claim that a gust of the north wind blew her over the rocks where she was playing with Pharmacia, and once she was killed that way, people said she had been carried off by Boreas. But Socrates tells us he's more interested in understanding himself than in explaining myths away. He says, such explanations are amusing enough, but they are a job for a man I cannot envy at all. He'd have to be far too ingenious and work too hard, mainly because after that he will have to go on and give a rational account of the form of the hippocentaurs, and then of the chimera, and a whole flood of gorgons and pegasuses and other monsters in large numbers and absurd forms will overwhelm him. Anyone who does not believe in them, who wants to explain them away and make them plausible by means of some sort of rough ingenuity, will need a great deal of time. But I have no time for such things, and the reason, my friend, is this. I'm still unable, as the Delphic inscription orders, to know myself. And it really seems to me ridiculous to look into other things before I have understood that. That is why I do not concern myself with them. I can't help but feel there's something a bit more going on with Socrates here, that Socrates, as he so often does, is not telling us the whole truth. It seems implausible to me that he simply has a lack of time to reduce these myths. I can't help but suspect he really doesn't want to, and I think the reason for that is simple. He loves them. He senses in them, I suspect, some sort of truth that perhaps evades quick and easy attempts by scientific reason to reduce them to crude physical principles. And what this actually means, I think, is that Plato is giving us another hint of the fundamental unity of the psyche, a unity of what feels good and is true. Socrates seems to have an unspoken confidence that these myths, these stories that for some mysterious reason tend to have an immediate appeal to us, are also getting at the truth in some way. And indeed, he uses an example of one of these mythical creatures with reference to the soul in the very next sentence or so, a sentence I've quoted before in this series, that voices the central question of this dialogue, and also really of this entire video series. He asks Phaedrus, "Am I a beast more complicated?" And the Greek word is polyplokdoteron, having more twists, more tangles. Am I a beast more complicated and savage than Typhon? And Typhon was a mythical monster. Or am I a tamer, simpler animal with a share in a divine and gentle nature? And by the way, here's Hesiod's description of Typhon. From his shoulders grew 100 heads of a snake, a fearful dragon with dark, flickering tongues, and from under the brows of his eyes in his marvelous heads flashed fire, and fire burned from his heads as he glared. And there were voices in all his dreadful heads, which uttered every kind of sound unspeakable. For at one time they made sounds such that the gods understood, but at another the noise of a bull bellowing aloud in proud, ungovernable fury, and at another the sound of a lion, relentless of heart, and at another sounds like whelps, wonderful to hear, and again at another he would hiss so that the high mountains re-echoed. Well, I think that's just kind of astonishing. I think I'm just amazed at the power of this mythical language to convey ideas about the psyche with this almost endless multiplicity of voices it seems to have. So anyway, Socrates asks whether the psyche is this or whether it's a simpler creature, and the word he uses for simpler is haplusteron, i.e. not containing multiplicity. You may be familiar with this related term from biology, haploid, having a single set of chromosomes. Anyway, I mentioned before how once you consider that Plato saw the one and the good as the same, as Aristotle said he did, you kind of can't unsee it, because then you notice it cropping up in the dialogues in all sorts of ways. And here we seem to have it again. The soul is a kind of microcosm here, in that its goodness lies in its unity. And we have, I think, another sort of erotic green flag in Plato's description of the setting of the conversation between Socrates and Phaedrus. It conveys a sense of being at one, both with nature and perhaps with one's own nature, and with myth, And I can't help but read that description too. Once they pick a spot to lie down, Socrates says, "By Hera, it really is a beautiful resting place. The plane tree is tall and very broad. The chaste tree, high as it is wonderfully shady. And since it is in full bloom, the whole place is filled with its fragrance. From under the plane tree, the loveliest spring runs with very cool water. Our feet can testify to that. The place appears to be dedicated to Archelaus and some of the nymphs, if we can judge from the statues and votive offerings. Feel the freshness of the air. How pretty." And, lost my place here. "How pretty and pleasant it is. How it echoes with the summer sweet song of the cicadas' chorus. The most exquisite thing of all, of course, is the grassy slope. It rises so gently that you can rest your head perfectly when you lie down on it. And it's kind of like a paradise on earth, isn't it? And makes me feel like I need to get some sort of research fellowship to study in Greece. Anyway, and it's also mentioned that they both happen to be walking barefoot, by the way, which is kind of neat. Now onto the red flags. I've emphasized the hint we have here that this passion both Socrates and Phaedrus display for speeches could suggest that Plato is saying here that the realms of feeling and thinking are in some way harmonious, that these aspects of the soul form a harmonious unity. But perhaps it would be better to say that it helps set out the problem. Because on the one hand, true, there's a tendency for Socrates' inclinations to, in a way, be always right, for his foibles to, in a way, end up being redeemed in the dialogues. For example, when he openly talks about something being a folly of his, he's being ironic, dressing up as a foible, something that the reader ends up finding out is a virtue, like his often touted interest in the erotic, behind which we find, in my opinion, astonishing truths about the human psyche. But we don't know at this point whether this is what you would call a healthy enthusiasm or obsession for speeches and words. Just as the cult of Bacchus in Euripides' play has this blind and destructive element, we don't know whether something similarly blind and irrational might be behind this passion they share for speeches. And actually, at one point, Socrates even describes Lysias' speech as a pharmakon, which could mean in Greek both a drug and a poison, or it could mean either a drug or a poison. And so again, in this dialogue, which is so different, as I mentioned, in setting from the symposium, we have yet another shared theme, this theme of intoxication and kind of the loss of the self in a way, or the expansion of the boundaries of the self, which I think curiously sort of amount to the same thing in a way. But anyway, now we have, of course, the biggest red flag of all, Lysias' speech. As Socrates points out after Phaedrus reads it, this speech really consists in many ways of communicating the same basic idea that a sexual partner motivated by eros, emotional attachment, will behave irrationally in various ways that will be burdensome to the other partner. Even those who are in this state of erotic passion, he says, recognize that they're not well. They actually have, Lysias says, a kind of sickness. And this means a lot of unnecessary drama, as we would say today. Eros, Lysias says, means all kinds of emotional volatility. It's contrary to this great Greek virtue of moderation. And it results in behavior that's publicly embarrassing, if not actually hurtful to the beloved. And so Lysias says in his speech, you should feel sorry for tois eromenos, those who are beloved by those with sexual passion. You should feel sorry for them, not admire them. I think we're probably meant to see here, actually, a scientific reduction of sexual desire similar to the kind of reduction that Socrates mentioned in regard to myth. I mean, an understanding of it as a purely physical drive, a kind of attempt to sort of explain it away through these crude physical principles. Just a physical drive that has nothing to do with the psyche. And as I mentioned, having this red flag waved in front of our faces in this speech that deals with eros in the narrow sense of sexual passion, we can't then help but wonder if the same applies to eros in this wider Platonic sense, human motivation as such. And so we're nudged to confront this question that is so laden, I think, with hope and despair. Am I one or many? Am I a monster like Typhon, or am I a simple and basically good creature? Socrates doesn't share Phaedrus's enthusiasm for the speech. His initial response is to damn it with faint praise. He's transported to ecstasy, but that has nothing to do with any truth it might convey. He characteristically feigns ignorance and claims that he's moved simply because in that state of ignorance, it's easy for him to just get caught up in Phaedrus's obvious enthusiasm and just go along with the whole thing. He says, it's a miracle. And the Greek word, that seems like a somewhat, that word seems somewhat laden with Christian theology. The Greek word is daimonios. But I think, translation always poses these problems, because once if you keep it as daimonios, then you have to go into an explanatory note, and I suppose translators and publishers don't want books that are laden with footnotes. But anyway, it's daimonios, my friend. I'm in ecstasy, literally, I'm struck or driven out of myself. And it's all you're doing, Phaedrus. I was looking at you while you were reading, and it seemed to me the speech had made you radiant with delight. And since I believe you understand these matters better than I do, I followed your lead, and following you, I shared your Bacchic frenzy. Well, actually, the Greek is sort of your divine state of extremity, which I guess was probably considered a bit maybe too awkward. But it doesn't actually mention Bacchus, although I suppose it's probably, alluding to it or a similar mystery cult in some way. So anyway, Socrates is characteristically hiding a lot. And we don't believe for a minute that he doesn't think he understands Eros as well as Phaedrus, or Lysias for that matter. In fact, we might even suspect that he has a whole theory of Eros in his mind, that he's actually just bursting to expound. And in that, of course, we'd be right. What we get from Socrates in this dialogue is a theory or vision of Eros that will allow us, I think, to understand what the prophetess Diotima meant in the Symposium when she said that what humans desire is nothing but the good. And in so doing, it will also help us understand the theme of this entire series, which is, of course, how Platonic love can give you a better life. It's what we'll be starting to look at next week, and I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.